Hey, Chris.
What's up, Jason?
Man, just early morning recording.
Yeah, it feels like we recorded just 2 days ago.
We did. We're such pros now.
I know. It's what's this episode? You said 30?
32.
32. Man, that's nuts.
I thought we had given up by now, and or people would just tell us to shut the blank up.
Well, so far so good though.
Well, maybe they are saying that. We just don't know it.
Yeah, privately.
So as our kind of recent, I don't even know the word I'm looking for, like we've been doing lately, we have a guest today. Avdi, do you mind saying hello and maybe giving kind of a brief introduction?
Oh, sure. Hi, I'm Avdi Grimm, and I do developer education stuff. Most notably, probably, is the Ruby Tapas screencast series, and some books, and I do some speaking at conferences and stuff like that.
Well, welcome on the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So one question we kind of like to ask all our guests, how did you get started programming?
Programming was kind of in the air in my household. My dad kind of straddled the line between hardware engineering and software engineering. And while I did not learn programming from him, it was just sort of like, there were computers around, which is always a big leg up. And, and that kind of made it an obvious career choice. I remember taking some early stabs at learning to program, and then when I in my brief stint at community college, I took a couple of programming courses, and then I kind of through some good fortune, I sort of stumbled into a full-time programming job at a defense contractor when I was 18, and kind of just kept going from there.
What kind of programming were you doing at the defense contractor?
It was a lot of C++, working in embedded systems and networking middleware systems, a lot of different architectures, different types of computers it was running on. Also did a fair stint working in like 68,000 assembler and assembly. Stuff like that. And then branched out a little bit into various other things, spent some time doing VB6 to crunch data from spreadsheets and learned Perl while I was there because I needed to crunch lots of data and I didn't feel like doing it in C. And eventually like kind of explored all of the scripting languages. And it was in that process that I wound up really, really liking Ruby and building some internal tools in Ruby.
Were you doing Ruby when you're still at the defense
internally
contractor?
It was kind of one of those things where they're like, we need this tool to be updated to work on our new hardware, and I was like, this tool is horrible and half the source code isn't even there, and we have to link it to this this one golden object file because the source code and the compiler is lost. And I was like, I don't want to extend this C. Why don't I just rewrite it in Ruby? And they're like, what's Ruby? I'm like, don't worry about it.
What version of Ruby
I don't know.
that?
That was probably back in like the 1.6-ish era. 1.4, 1.6, something like that.
Wow, that's pretty early. I think my earliest was like 187 or something around there.
I'm in this generation of Ruby programmers for whom like the 187 changes are still sort of like, yay, those are so cool. But I mean, to be perfectly honest, when you talk about Ruby, is this a Ruby show? This is a Ruby show, right? Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we call it remote Ruby.
So I can actually geek out about Ruby a little bit. To be perfectly honest, like Ruby as a language doesn't really change as much as other languages. Like I want to say like 80 to 90% of the stuff that I use now was already in Ruby at that point.
Yeah, I was doing Python before I got into Ruby, and I remember the sort of Python 2 to 3 thing, which apparently still is an ongoing process for some projects. I remember just like the Ruby 2 transition was so much easier. It just seemed like the community was happy to adopt all those features and stuff, but it didn't seem like it changed as significantly, which I thought was cool.
Well, I think, I mean, some of that you can chalk up to I think the fundamental design of Ruby, which, I mean, there are aspects, Ruby is a big language in terms of syntax, but the syntax changes relatively slowly. And the big, I think, decision that made a difference early on was that like most of the language features would be library features. Like we're not going to have a whole lot of different iteration constructs built into the syntax. We're not going to have syntactical what are they called? Not reductions. What is that thing in Python? Comprehensions. We're not going to have special syntax for that. It's just going, if you need to do some kind of comprehension type deal, you're going to chain together a bunch of enumerable operations. And, like that kind of choice, making almost everything ascend to an object, meant that, if you wanted to add, and then having the blocks be really convenient, meant that if you wanted to add like a new control construct or something, like recently we've seen, what is it, yield self, which is now being aliased to then, which is a really cool little construct, but it's purely a method being added to objects. It doesn't actually add any new syntax to the language. And, it's that kind of thing, which is sort of Smalltalk inspired, where like Smalltalk and Lisp inspired, where, everything is a method call. And if you want to add a new construct to the language, you're just adding a new method call. And that makes things a lot easier than when you're constantly changing syntax.
Did you ever write any Smalltalk?
Yeah, a little bit. I spent some time, not for work, but just in an effort to get more familiar with the roots of Ruby. I spent some time learning Pharaoh Smalltalk, which is a free Smalltalk that you can go out and get, and it's quite nice.
I've always been curious about Smalltalk because, like, I've only worked in Ruby and Rails, but like a lot of what I consider like OG Ruby programmers reference Smalltalk. Like DHH talks about like one of his favorite books is a Smalltalk book. But I've never looked at it. So I am curious. You said you were working for the defense contractor, and now you have Ruby Tapas. You work for yourself. What's the story between going from the defense contractor to?
It was
Ruby
basically
Tapas?
Just a progression of getting deliberately getting more and more independent over time. It's like smaller and more independent, so it went, I spent way too long in the defense contractor world. And after like 8 or 9 years, finally, I got fed up. It takes me way too long to get fed up for my own good. And jumped to a much smaller company. It was about 50 employees, I think, actually had a some very, very large Rails applications that had started in the pre 1.0 era. And so I spent a couple of years there, and they were working on automations for clinical trials. And then from there, I spent a year at a startup where I was like employee number one. Which did what most startups do, which is fizzle out. And then after that, I jumped to consulting, and spent a few years consulting, and then kind of spent some time doing what I call pair programming consulting. So I would just like take appointments with people who wanted some coaching or some extra eyes on a piece of code, which I still do. I still do some of that occasionally. Call them rubber duck sessions. And then let's see. Yeah, and while I was doing that, I started publishing the Ruby Tapas videos, and that gradually grew from being a side gig to being a full-time deal.
That's awesome. Chris, I guess, has a similar path. Am I wrong in that, Chris?
Yeah. It's, the working for startups and then at some point realizing like you're investing a lot of effort and things tend to fizzle out. So yeah, I ended up going into consulting and then, doing the same sort of screencasting and things. Yeah, it seems like a funnily similar path there.
I've noticed recently, I think it's on Twitter, you've been working on some JavaScript materials.
Yeah, I've been working
right?
with Betsy Hable on a course that she's developing. It's all about like understanding the asynchronous features of JavaScript better, and we can totally come up with a link for that for your show notes.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I'm really curious about that. It also kind of piqued my interest too, because mostly the material that I've read from you has been Ruby, and so I was kind of curious, maybe what if it was your project, what inspired you to work on it. But it sounds like, I guess, it's Betsy's project.
This is true. I mean, she helped me out a lot with my my MOOM course, the Mastering the Object-Oriented Mindset in Ruby and Rails. Long title. She helped me out a lot with that. We did a series of pair programming videos for that, which are actually still being published to that course. And now I'm helping her out with the Async.js course. But I mean, it's also a deliberate direction for me. It's not just random. As a younger programmer, I think I spent a lot more time thinking about like what is the best language and what language do I want to be working in. I still really enjoy working in Ruby. But these days, I'm much more interested in leverage, what technologies have the most leverage. And I'll be perfectly honest, when I meet friends out in the non-programming world and they're like, how do I get into programming? I absolutely cannot in good conscience say, start with Ruby. It's not that Ruby is a terrible language to learn in. It's not. It's a decent language to learn in. But the problem, and yes, you can learn in any programming language and then sort of transfer that into others. But if you want like the fastest on ramp to the largest variety of programming jobs at this point, and just being able to like communicate with other programmers, that place is now JavaScript. I mean, it used to be C, and then for a while it was Java. And now it's JavaScript. JavaScript is like this huge on-ramp at this point where there's so many people out there to help you. And there's so much going on there. And there are so many different, there's front-end stuff and there's back-end stuff. And it's just, it's become a lingua franca. And that's big. That's important. Network effects are important. And also, JavaScript as a language is moving surprisingly fast and is doing a pretty good job of stamping out some of its gnarliest bits. So yeah, I'm interested in like talking to the largest number of programmers and also being able to converse with them and just being able to be useful to the largest number of programmers out there.
You touched on something I think about a lot, and actually, I've talked to a couple other devs in Memphis about. I recently had a friend who became a programmer, and like he went the Ruby route, and was luckily able to find a job. But like I struggled. Like I think like we're best friends, so I think part of his Ruby decision was maybe because like that's what I do. But like I struggle to tell people like Ruby as a first language because it seems like the majority of like jobs in like Ruby and Rails that everybody's looking for like a senior level engineer, and it feels like the junior level jobs in Ruby aren't there.
I mean, that's what happens. I mean, it's that's what happens when you have a maturing technology where a lot of the work is in large existing code bases, and it's also what happens because we have a messed up industry that doesn't value leveling people up in house nearly as much as it should.
Yeah. So kind of talking about languages, I'm curious to get your thoughts because I mean, you mentioned you made a course on mastering
Yes.
object-oriented programming. And right now, there's, like functional programming is a pretty hot topic for some. And I guess I see it a lot in Ruby because of Elixir. And so like, I'm curious because I really like some of the functional programming fundamentals, but I still like find myself using Ruby, and just trying to apply those to Ruby. But there are some people, not everyone, of course, but there are some people who like make this switch, like doing functional programming full time, and they disown OOP like it is a horrible thing. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
So I'm going to piss some people off here. First off, Elixir isn't a functional programming language. It's a much more object-oriented programming language than Ruby. If you want to have fun with functional programming, do it in a Lisp, do it in Clojure, or do it in Scheme, or go the opposite direction and do it in Haskell or Elm if you want to have fun with a really strongly typed programming language that won't let you make mistakes. But Elixir is not the way to have fun with functional programming. It totally is a way to do object-oriented programming the way that Alan Kay intended. So yeah, I think I've pissed off as many people as possible within a short number of sentences.
I guess like when I think about like when I hear people talk about like how OOP is bad, like it's really easy for me. I guess I'm really easy persuaded. It's really easy for me to be like, oh yeah, wow, that is really bad. But then like I often like combat that thought with like, well, maybe I just don't really like understand OOP. And I feel like I've read a couple of articles about like, and you kind of just hit like, do you think there's just a lot of like misconception around object-oriented?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, because I mean, for one thing, it's almost nobody has done it yet. I don't feel like I can speak to this the best. The very best thing that I've seen written about this recently is an answer that Alan Kay wrote actually very recently on Quora, where he's been very active on Quora recently, and somebody asked like, what is are object-oriented programming and functional programming in conflict? And I think he's the most qualified to answer that question, because not only is he the person that defined object-oriented programming, but he did it in languages that were strongly based on Lisp, and so he really knows how to bring those two worlds together. And the answer is no, they're not incompatible at all. And he goes into some detail over how. And basically, he's saying that objects are a higher level abstraction than functions, and objects give you a kind of cellular breakdown of a program into components that can be in process or could be easily factored out into a separate process or a separate machine altogether. They sort of give you this, turtles all the way down idea of little active agents that are acting on streams of messages. And internally, you can implement those agents just as Elixir and Erlang do. You can implement those agents in terms of stateless transforms on data. And so objects basically become world lines of their stable states. Objects are you could think of objects as functions plus history. So objects, I think, are really fundamentally they're a way of working really well with messages, where messages is the most important idea here. And objects are a way of embracing the fact that state is real, and that nothing important we do exists without state and without history and without effects upon the world.
So I'm curious now. I'm gonna, I guess, kind of shift gears a little bit. Going back to, you said JavaScript is more of like it's more of a larger community, a lot more jobs, a lot of things around JavaScript right now. Do you see any other languages you think are kind of becoming like, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of trending towards the future of programming, or that's a bad way to put it, but trending towards like more of the strength of JavaScript?
I don't know. Building on JavaScript, TypeScript has a lot of momentum going now. It seems to have captured the lion's share of the like compile to JavaScript language energy. So that's interesting. It's sort of they've taken a very pragmatic approach of, we're not going to build a new language on top of JavaScript. We're just going to have a totally compatible superset that adds some things that keep you safer. So that's an interesting direction that I'm following. I don't know. There's still plenty of steam in the Java ecosystem, and lots of stuff, interesting stuff built on there. But it's hard to predict these things. It's hard to predict what's going to take off. I mean, Ruby never should have taken off the way it did. It's just that DHH wrote Rails in it, and that sort of made all the difference. So a lot of times it's not, very, very few languages directly, become popular because of their merits. I mean, indirectly, yes. Sense. I mean, the reason DHH wrote Rails in Ruby was because it was the most amenable to the kind of thing that he was trying to do. But yeah, I don't know. I think the next phase is something that we can't imagine yet. That's generally true.
That's fair. So also now, I guess, switching gears again, I've noticed you've had some guest chefs on Ruby Thomas. Yeah. Quite a few, actually.
Great.
How's that going?
I really love doing it. It's a really refreshing change to work on bringing somebody else's expertise to the fore instead of my own, and brings a lot of different perspectives to the show, and it gives me a chance to do something that I really enjoy, which is like just working with people to help them take something that they know and turn that into a narrative that connects with other people. So yes,
that's awesome.
And I'm often on the lookout for new guests. So if there's something important that you have to say to Ruby developers, whether it's directly about Ruby or just about being a good programmer, I would be interested in talking to you.
That's awesome. I assume maybe this is a misconception. Do you find that it like frees up more time for you to do other things?
Yes and no. There is more of my time that goes into it than is apparent. I realized recently that in talking to people at conferences, I realized that some people were under the impression that, like guest chefs are basically just submitting their videos to me and then I'm publishing them, which nothing could be further from the truth. We go through building a guest episode is a process that's scheduled out over a series of around 8 weeks, and involves multiple meetings with them to like develop a solid topic idea and then develop their script with them and make sure that they have a great narrative arc to the script and that it fits in well with the rest of the content and doesn't make reference to things that people won't know what that reference is about, and just generally like make sure that it's up to my standards. And yeah, so it's a long collaborative process of development, and hopefully the results are good.
That's great. So I haven't really announced it yet. I probably will before this releases, but you're coming back for a third year, Southeast Ruby, which
me too.
I'm so excited for. I love having you come to that conference. Do you have any more conferences lined up?
Let's see. This is the one where I have to figure out which ones are public.
Oh yeah. Well, so I know. I think I saw you speaking at a JavaScript conference.
Nordic.js in the fall. I forget exactly when it is, but in the fall. That's going to be fun. And then, what else? I always blank at this point. I believe I'm going to be, actually, this is sort of a late edition, but I'm going to be at Deliver Agile in Nashville in just a few months. I don't know if that's public yet.
Cool.
And I don't know. I'm having trouble remembering the other ones. I think I've got one or two others coming down the pipe. But my mind always blanks.
Yeah, no worries. Do you enjoy public speaking? Is that a thing? Because it's a thing I like to do, but like I get crippled like before it's time to do it, and that has recently led to me like not submitting.
Really?
Ever.
So tell me more about that.
Yeah, so like I have a wicked like anxiety disorder. The actual term is generalized anxiety disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder. It's like those two things together. And so like, I guess it was, it's 2019, 2017. Like I did both Rails and RubyConf and like got to do some other conferences. And it was like, it felt like a really like hot year for me. And then like last year I got to where I was like afraid of rejection. So I just stopped submitting. Like it just like, I helped review a friend's like RailsConf proposal a few weeks ago or however long. And I was like, oh, I should submit, and like pulled it up and like looked at all the topics. I was like, oh, I could like write a proposal for like this and this and this. And then I was like, no, I can't do this. Like, and I just shut down. So
that's rough. I know there's a lot of anxiety associated with speaking. I still get a little nervous, especially like, so this last November, I did a series of talks. I went on a conference tour called YOW, which is a 3-city tour in Australia, and it was sort of a bigger event than I'd ever done before. And I was really, really nervous. It was a new crowd for me, and didn't know how they would, take the stuff that I had. And honestly, my first talk, I really didn't do that well, partly because of all the anxiety. So it's an ongoing struggle.
There were also some like pretty big names on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, right? It was keynoted by, among other folks, Kent Beck and Jessica Kerr, and Chad Fowler was there, and a lot of good folks.
So for anybody that is new to giving conference talks, what advice would you give those people?
I mean, there's so many things to say about it, and I'm never sure like what's the most important advice. I think for me, with my own particular set of neuroses is, don't worry about too much of the advice. Like there are a lot of blog posts and talks out there about doing better talks. And I always found those incredibly intimidating as a young speaker. Like the idea that I have to be good at my I need to like have my slides be really like high quality according to like how this one speaker says that my slides should be good, and my my delivery should be really good according to how this other speaker says, and my transition should be really good, and I should have a good narrative arc, and I should have something funny and just, I just found a lot of that stuff incredibly intimidating. And one of the things that was important to me was just giving myself permission to suck on like every single axis except one. Like pick one axis to be good on at a time. So like my first talks, it was like I knew that I had some solid and novel technical material. And that was it. Everything else was terrible. My delivery was terrible. My slides were terrible. My narrative arc was terrible. I wasn't funny, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I had some good technical material. That doesn't have to be the thing that you're good at. I mean, you could, your first thing to focus on could be being funny and the heck with all the rest. But yeah, like that's for newer speakers. That's like, other than just focus on one thing at a time. For God's sake, submit to lots of conferences. Some of them are going to accept your stuff, but if you just like hang all of your expectations on a single conference that you submitted to, then like that rejection is going to be your one experience of submitting. Chances are that your one first submission to one conference is going to be rejected because, I mean, it's just probability. So, submit far and wide, and also speak at users groups and just like get used to making lots of submissions and get used to getting a lot of rejections and a few acceptances out of that.
That's really good advice. I like the, focus on doing one thing well. 'Cause yeah, if you read those articles of, worrying about being funny and having a narrative and everything,
don't forget like your how you stand on the stage and how you use your arms, and it's endless. Like there is no end to what you can perfect. And it gets better with time, and you get like, as you sort of nail down one aspect, it frees up mental space to focus on other aspects, but don't worry about it at first.
Yeah, that's so true. And that advice applies to, I think a lot of programmers try and do things. You want to do it right the first time. And there's just so many things to worry about that you just have to like start small and like, number one, make it work. Then you can go and think about, did you name your variables well, and so on.
I used to spend so much wasted time on like, I'm going to pick the best language. And I'm going to read a bunch of reviews of the different web frameworks that are associated with this language. And I'm going to pick the best one with the best features, as my first, to write my first app in, and of course, what I would always wind up doing is picking some obscure thing that sounded like it improved on all the others. Cause obviously I didn't want to start like behind on something that was old and busted, and so I'd pick something obscure, and it would be something that nobody could help me with. So yeah, it's kind of a similar thing. It's a little different, but it's just like, don't worry about optimizing all the different aspects of anything at the beginning. Just like jump in and worry about one thing at a time.
I know we're like talking about conference talks, but before we started this, Chris and I were just talking about something similar to this, because like I'm working on a side project and it's like a Rails app, but I use the term like I freeze a lot because I'm so worried about like trying to make the best decision like ahead of time on like a side project that may never even like make any money. And so like I'm like worried about like how I organize, like, should this be a service object? And like, well, what should I use to build that? Like, and that actually recently, that same question brought me to, an article you had written. I just like Googled like service objects. And one of your articles like completely changed my mind on that, which is an aside. But yeah, I'm I'm so worried about over optimizing that I never get anything done sometimes.
So much of the stuff that's written out there is written from the perspective of somebody who had a colossal hairball of a problem. You know, I mean, our industry is badly infected with the syndrome of like, if Google does it this way, then we should go do it this way. Well, no, you shouldn't. Google is huge, and their code bases are huge, and their problems are different from yours. Like, that is not an argument that makes any sense. And then the same goes for, you know, Facebook or Amazon or anybody. And, you know, so you have all these like best practice publications that come out of these companies, and they have nothing to do with your context. And, you know, like I know which article you're talking about is the one where I slag on service objects and say that we should be representing processes, you know, workflows as objects rather than individual transactions. And I stand by that, and I've been giving talks about that. But at the same time, if your app is a to-do list, you don't have a lot of workflows in your app. And honestly, you can probably get away with just throwing all of your logic in your controllers, in your Rails controllers, and be done with it. Like, you don't have to apply a practice from the very beginning, I guess. And a lot of times that's just counterproductive. You know, if there's some practice that was extracted out of organizing large quantities of code, if you don't have large quantities of code, then that's not the thing to be worrying about at that point.
Yeah, and like one of the things I think Chris brought up was like, if it does continue to grow, like those things can be refactored, like into
get better at refactoring
patterns and processes if you actually need them.
Yeah, it's always the thing that people forget is like, it's just a process. Like, you can always change things at any time. In fact, software is one of the easiest things to change. So, you know, like, you don't have to do it perfectly the first time, but you always like have this dream of what you want to build and accomplish. And you're like, oh, I'm going to make the best whatever possible. And then it's very easy as humans for us to forget about the complexity of things or all those little weird edge cases we have to deal with. And that's really where we get bogged down on. And it's just, you know, the ideal is just to embrace those things as they come up and then, you know, think about them and just kind of work knowing that those things are going to happen instead of trying to do it perfect the first time.
My friend Jessica Kara likes to talk about sematheses, which is like, you know, your software project should be, it should be a system which is composed of both it's a socio-technical system. It's composed of people and technical parts. And the aim of the system should be constant learning. The aim of the system is, you know, hopefully, you know, good things, useful product will fall out of that. But the aim of the system, of the socio-technical system, is constant learning. And I think that's a better orientation than on like turning out the perfect product made of the perfect parts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because, you know, I mean, how many times has your product changed once you get it out to customers? Like, the first time you build it, you assume a bunch of stuff. Then people ask for other things and you're like, oh, we have to change that. And so really it's always coming down to, you know, it needs to
there's no
continuously
perfection.
evolve.
There's just what's right for right now.
And that, and like you were saying, like, you know, I always find this interesting. And one of the reasons why Ruby is so great, in my opinion, is like, you know, we're writing code almost for humans more than we are for computers, in a sense, because it's very readable for us, which is like, you know, computers don't really have too much trouble interpreting our code anymore, but humans really struggle with that sometimes. And so in the future, I imagine we'll just have things that feel more and more natural for humans to understand, but that's been one of the things we're finally getting towards, instead of, dealing with a whole lot of memory allocations and worrying about the little details. As humans, we can think about the higher level
Absolutely.
concepts when we code now.
And something to keep in mind there, I think, is it's not just about being able to comprehend. It's not just about being able to read the intent of code really well. I think a lot of times, that has been a strong emphasis in the Ruby world, and it's great. But a lot of times we stop at, you should be able to read the code and understand it. And this is another of those things that Jessica and I have been talking about a lot lately, and I've been like tweeting about it a little bit, it goes beyond that static readability. The important thing is comprehensibility, the ability to understand the system, not just as it is, and it's, as it is in code, but also as it runs. And there's a lot of stuff that's worth focusing on there, involving at the most basic level, decent logging, and then you can get into things like structured logging and stuff like that. But also looking at how you handle failures, how you handle errors, whether you're doing error messages or whether you're doing helpful support messages. One of I was listing on Twitter the other day, like some of the sort of values that I try to optimize for these days. And one of the things I said was communication over, how did I put it? Communication over correctness. Like, I would much rather have a system that fails, but in the process tells me what it was trying to do, than a system that is, perfectly correct, but inscrutable.
Yeah, that's really, really good. 'Cause it comes down to not like, we don't exactly care what the code is specifically doing. We care about what it is intended to do. And that surfaces in your errors and everything. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like that wording of it. It makes a lot of sense in the real goal that you're going after.
I think, speaking of a tweet like you sent literally right before that one, you said things I'm no longer interested in optimizing for, and one of those was simplicity.
Yeah.
Would you mind explaining that one?
Simplicity is such a ridiculous area of focus for developers. I think we hold it up as this holy grail, and it's completely unachievable. So one of the people that I've been following lately, one of the movements that I've been following lately is the resilience engineering community, and one of the people who's like sort of at the center of that is John Allspaw, and he's got some talks out there where he talks about how complexity is inherent to value. Like, complexity, if it's inherent to success, if your system is successful, it's going to acquire complexity. And if you're, that doesn't mean that, making your system complex is going to make it successful, but this is just, successful systems are complex systems. It's part and parcel. And, anytime you run across somebody who says that they're going to make your system simpler with some tool or something, never trust that. This is snake oil. I think a lot of people sincerely believe that they're making things simpler, but the thing about complexity is that you never get rid of it. You just push it around. It's like bubbles under plastic. And yeah, so yeah, I'm not interested in optimizing for simplicity. I'm interested in value. I think that was the way that I put it in the later tweet, was value over simplicity. I'd much rather we have a learning system, a semathesy that's mature in working with complexity, than try for false ideals of simplicity. Like the whole, we're going to make really, really simple microservices. Okay. But then, your network of microservices is going to be complex, and that's fine. It's fine to have a network of microservices that's complex, but don't mistake that from simplicity. And make sure that you develop some kind of competence in understanding the interactions and of making those interactions between the microservices comprehensible. Using logging, using a good, universal message bus where you can trace out what the heck happened and replay it and stuff like that.
That excuse me. So that actually like really hits home for me because like one of the things I like don't tell people this a lot, but like I really like am big into the idea of like minimalism as like a concept of like just my personal life, not necessarily programming. But like kind of out of that, I was like, oh well, like maybe I'm just making like coding too complex. Like I need to make it simpler, and so like, that became like my like pitchfork, right? But the thing like I've come to terms with the last like 3 or 4 months is that most of the times like my idea of like trying to make things simpler honestly just like ends up making it more complex. And like I keep like trying to strip down things to their simplest point, but then like there's so many levels of like indirection. And it just like it's hard for me to follow. I can't imagine someone else coming up behind me and trying to like follow where all these.
Yeah, well,
like,
I mean, and this is the thing. Like, so, usually when people talk about making things simpler, usually they have some proxy. Simpler is a proxy for some other value. Like, for a Go programmer, making things simpler is removing indirection and making things like more verbose, but doing more things obviously rather than implicitly. For a typical Ruby programmer, it's the opposite direction. Simplicity, by simplicity, they often mean abstraction. They often mean indirection, so that you have less going on in any individual point in the program, but then the execution sort of wends its way through lots of small bits instead of one big bit. Those are both things that have been held up as simplicity over the years. And neither of them is simplicity. They're just different styles of organization.
Yeah, that hits home so well. Before we wrap up, so one of the things I really appreciate and admire is kind of how honest you are on social media. Like, it's one of like my big qualms with social media is like we always like put the best forward, and then everybody like thinks their life sucks. So I am curious, like you've talked about some of the things you like enjoy doing, but I'd just like to hear like what do you like to do for fun when you're not programming? Like what?
I mean, the biggest thing is dancing. I try to take myself out dancing as often as possible. I go to electronic music clubs and nights and dance my head off. So that's like number one. I like to hike too. Hiking is nice. I live out in the woods, and so I get a nice, a nice kind of combination of fun with other people, and then fun out in the middle of nowhere with quiet and woods and squirrels. Yeah, those are big ones. I also really like just like going out to cool little brew pubs and having local beers and stuff like that, or fancy cocktails. I'm a total fan of that kind of thing. And hanging out with, something that I've emphasized a lot over the past year. Like you said, I'm pretty open on social media. And so, I don't make I don't hide the fact that, over the past 2 years, my life kind of completely fell apart and got put together again in a very different configuration. And, part of the fallout from that was deciding to, put a lot more energy into just making friends and being with friends. And, so I try to, spend a lot more time, meeting people for lunch and, being out and about in a way that I can be with friends and family.
I can imagine that like working for yourself in the woods, finding friends to like get out with would be very valuable. Because I live like in the city and I work from home and I still get lonely. So, well, Chris, any other questions? Things you're curious about?
I think that's it. Well, thanks for coming on. It was
my pleasure.
Really fun talking to you, Avdi. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at Southeast Ruby again.
Are any kind of
I mean, my
links you
like,
want to
you
mention?
can follow me on Twitter, Avdi,
Please.
AVDI on Twitter. I've got a website, like my main, it's not really up to date or anything, but my main, like programmer presence website is avdi.codes. And, yeah, you can kind of find stuff from there. RubyTopus.com. RubyTopus.com is where I make all my videos, and you can subscribe for monies and support my way of life out here in the woods, typing away. Yeah, those are the big ones, I think.
Great. Well, like Chris said, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate you, and I'm glad that like through Southeast Ruby, I've got to like know you. And I think as a community and like an industry, you make it better. So thank you. All right, Chris. Well, at this rate, we'll probably record another episode tomorrow.
Yeah, it'll be a crazy week.
All right. Talk to you soon.
See ya.